Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our web event, Publishing Your Research Inside the Head of a Journal Editor with our great host, Richard Wallace, who we'll introduce in just a second. Please share your name and your affiliation in the chat box if you would like, and we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll start with Jessica. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. As I run through the slides accidentally, sorry about that. So my name is Jessica Johnston. I am Education Programs Coordinator with the Ecological Society of America, and I'm kind of the lead contact for the Scientists in Parks Fellows. But more importantly, I would say there's a new kind of role that ESA is taking on, which is an engagement portion to provide professional development webinar series for any intern or fellow or visiting scientist that is within the Scientists in Parks program. So that's kind of our big initiative. And this is our second time doing a webinar for engagement and professional development. And we are kind of new to this game. So your feedback and your interest in this program series is really important to us. So thank you for coming, and hopefully you have a good time and you learn some stuff. And I'll stop there and I'll give it back to Jessie.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessie Ribera. I'm the Society Programs Coordinator. I was brought on to help Jessica with planning this webinar series. So I hope to see you guys in future ones. If you want to go to the next slide. So a little housekeeping rules of this chat today. It's a really informal Q&A with ESA's Editor-in-Chief, Rich Wallace, who we'll introduce in a second. Please join in the conversation. You know, you can, if you would feel comfortable, you can turn on your video. And if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat if you're not in a place where you can ask them out loud, or, you know, raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask your question. Please keep your mic muted until we call upon you. And we also will be recording this event, so. Yes, so real quickly, our next webinar is going to be Science Communication Workshop on February 17th at 2 p.m. called Pitch It. So I hope you guys will register. Jessica will drop the registration link in the chat if it so interests you.
Yeah, I'll do that in a second.
Thank you.
Too many screens open.
All right, and now on to the main event. We'll introduce today's host, Richard Wallace. If you want to give us your background and we can get the chat started.
That sounds great. Thank you, Jessie and Jessica, so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you everyone who's joined us. This is great. I guess I'm gonna reiterate what Jessica said earlier. If you are able and willing to share your video, that's great. I do not have slides. This is designed to be a conversation, so it'd be great to see you if you're able and willing. If not, we'll still treat it as a conversation, and I'm happy to, you know, I'm going to introduce myself in a little bit more depth, and then we'll start talking about stuff. Some of you shared questions ahead of time, and we might use those to start, and then we'll talk a little bit about the National Park Service and the work that goes on there, and how publishing that work is vitally important, and what role I play in that, and other editors of other journals as well. So my name is Rich Wallace. I work for the Ecological Society of America, so that means that I am on staff there with Jessica and Jessie. And I work in the publications division, no surprise. And I am my principal role is as editor-in-chief of the journal Fronteirs in Ecology and the Environment. And I'm going to have, as I talk, sort of a bunch of links that I'll drop into the chat, so you can sort of see where it is that I'm pointing us to when I refer to things. And I've only been in this position for a year. Actually, last week was my 1-year anniversary, but I've been involved. Oh, thank you. I've been involved in publishing for a long time as an associate editor or an editorial board member, and before that, a reviewer, and throughout my whole career as an author, publishing in scientific journals. And so I came to this job with having spent a lot of years sort of thinking and acting on the importance of sharing information. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Prior to coming here, I spent almost 25 years as a college professor in environmental sciences, environmental studies and sciences. And that doesn't really say much in detail about what my background is. My deep background is that I have graduate degrees that are more or less split between public administration and ecology. And my work for about the first 10 years of my career was in the application of federal law to the protection of species and ecosystems. And on an even more micro level than that, I worked principally under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I worked for a while for a tiny government agency that few people have heard of called the Marine Mammal Commission. And then after that, I worked as a consultant and sort of looked at what the challenges were to implementing policy and regulations that came with an ecological mandate. I can talk more about that later if anybody's interested, but that's sort of my deep background. As I shifted to undergraduate education, which is where I spent my entire teaching career, I broadened out substantially. And for about the last 10 years, I've worked in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So I have developed both work and relationships both in Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park, and that's become one of my favorite. Those two parks, but also the larger ecosystem is one of my favorite places on Earth. So national parks are very close to me in terms of where my work is, my love of the outdoors, and sort of the most active work that I was doing before I started at the Ecological Society. So that's me in a nutshell. And what I do as editor-in-chief, and pretty much what any editor-in-chief of a journal does, is sort of shapes the vision for the type of content that's being communicated. So I'm going to cut right to the chase because we're all here together because of our shared interest in the national parks and our shared experience in the national parks. That there's so much critical work that is undertaken in national parks, both in the United States, obviously, which is the context for what we're doing here today, but all across the world. And using the national parks as a platform from which to conduct research, particularly interdisciplinary research, which is to say not just ecological or scientific, but research that crosses the boundaries between the ecological or the scientific and the social and the values related, because of what the mission of the Park Service is also vitally important. So what the journal that I'm in charge of, Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, sort of what our gestalt is, what our thing is really that is different from a lot of other scientific journals, is that we prioritize the ability of what we publish to be communicated to a broad and diverse audience. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of there's a lot of sort of stereotypical science journals out there. And that sounds like a criticism. It's not entirely a criticism, in which folks in one field are writing for other folks in the same field. And you have to learn the language of that field. And then your work gets read only by people in that field. So when I'm talking about the importance of work in the national parks and the type of work that in Frontiers, in my journal, we publish, I'm talking about work that is important to the public at large, and that we are trying to communicate to as broad a base of scientists and administrators and conservation professionals as possible. And someone asked Claire, I think it was you. I'm going to just call you out by name. I apologize. Hopefully that won't put you on the spot too much. But Claire, you shared a question ahead of today about does the National Park Service publish in my journal and in the Ecological Society journals? And the answer is yes, really actively. And in part for the reasons that I'm talking about now, particularly for my journal Frontiers, because we pride ourselves on articles, on papers that are written so that they are understandable by people outside the field of the authors. We get a lot of National Park Service folks and other agency folks and folks who work for conservation NGOs, as well as sort of more traditional academic researchers submitting stuff to us. But we're publishing probably at least a couple of National Park Service papers per year in our journal, and many more across all of the Ecological Society journals. And I'm recruiting actively, and I guess this could be a bridge towards sort of talking about what your interests are, because I've been talking for too long already. But I'm recruiting actively, and we all at the Ecological Society journals are interested in recruiting from folks in the national parks and in the agencies to consider how their work can fit in our journal, so that we can publish and provide you with a platform to have the voice that we believe that you should have, and that we can provide to you. So that's really important, and that's a little bit of a view into sort of my philosophy, as well as the sort of feelings I have about what it is that we do. I'm happy to open it up to questions. Again, I wanted this to be sort of an informal discussion. And I know that you all represent sort of different places, but also different stages in the early stages of your career, and so have different publishing needs. And I'm hoping to be able to, in the time that we have, address everybody's questions and provide some information that'll be helpful or useful for everybody, regardless of sort of where you are and what your perspectives on publishing are. But I'm happy to open it up if anyone has any questions after all my blather.
Hi, I have a question. So my name is Rachel, and I work at Petroglyph National Monument in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'm their community volunteer ambassador. So kind of like an internship, and something that I've started while I've been here. I've been here for almost a year, and I've been reinstated for next year. And so something I've started is a neighborhood newsletter. So basically it's just like 3 or 4 pages of kind of basic information for our volunteers and for a lot of the residents that live really close to the to the monument. Their neighborhoods are right by the monument. And we kind of want to reach out to them and give them information about what's going on in the park and how they can be more involved. And so that's kind of the primary purpose of it. And I guess going into my next year here, I've been wanting to add a little bit more something to it, a little bit more of a serious element, either about current events going on in the conservation world, or something having to do with wildlife, or things like that. And I'm not really sure where to start. This is kind of my first job, or this is kind of my first task of writing and publishing something, and it's on a small scale. But I just wanted to get your opinion on that. I'm going to law school for environmental law. And so I'm kind of trying to work something like with what I'm learning into what I'm publishing out to our volunteers and neighbors would be really great. And so just kind of having to go about that is kind of my question.
Yeah, that's great. First of all, congratulations on your renewal, and also on your law school plans.
Thank you.
And let me ask actually a clarifying question. Are you in terms of what the type of information that you're hoping to sort of put together and process and then reflect back into the community, is it mostly local focus, or would you like to bring issues from all over that you would share with your intended audience?
I think it could be from like outside, but just as long as it would be somehow related, like during COVID, we had a lot of more visitors. And I know that that has been a pretty widespread problem across national parks. And I say problem just because, you know, more people, unfortunately, means more trash in the monument, more unauthorized use. Like we have a lot of people a lot of neighbors who walk their dogs without a leash, and a lot of people that want to ride bikes in the monument, which is not allowed for tribal reasons. And then also people, you know, going off trail, creating social trails. So something that could be related to what's going on at Petroglyph would be really nice.
I got it. So thank you. That's very helpful. And I'm going to give an answer that's sort of general enough, because obviously I don't know Albuquerque well enough to sort of focus in at that level. But I'd like also to give an answer that's sort of general enough so that everybody who's listening, so that's relevant to everybody who's listening. But before I do that, I also want to make an offer, not just to you, Rachel, but to everybody, that if there are things that I'm talking about or that come up in questions either from you or from others that you would like to explore further, I am absolutely happy to hear from you after the webinar, right? And that's part of, it's something that I enjoy doing. I mean, I spent 25 years as a college professor, right? So I love talking with folks about stuff, but also in my job at the Ecological Society, you know, I have a sort of a technical job about putting out this journal on a monthly basis, but I am really a science communicator. That's how I see my job, and that's very important to me. So Jessica or Jessie, can I get one of you to put my email address, my ESA email address, into the chat, and then anybody who wants to contact me afterwards with a question that you didn't feel like asking or that you want to follow up on something, you should be welcome to do so. So my answer, Rachel, to you, that is sort of a general answer to everybody, has to do with sense of place, and the ways that we, in our field, which is sort of the ecological thinking, think about sense of place. And because I don't know New Mexico, I mean, I've been there, but I've never lived there. I've never spent enough time there to sort of know. I sort of default to this answer, and that is that everywhere that any of us lives and that any of us ever lives, there is this wealth of information, current information that's happening, historical information about the, you know, the evolution of culture as well as, you know, ecosystems that is just there to be found, right? So when I turned my attention, for example, to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem after having spent most of my career focused on the marine environment, which is harder to do in terms of sense of place, right? Because I was studying species that many of which were high seas species. How do you develop sense of place for the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Nobody's there reporting back on it. So there were some challenges, and so I had to rethink this, and obviously teaching sort of helps that. But when I oriented back to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, I found what those sources of information are, like literally, who are the people who are writing about the ecology, the culture, the intersection of those two, of the environmental issues, of the, you know, of the importance of community, and sometimes I found stuff that was, you know, like I helped to run an organization actually that's located in Jackson, Wyoming, conservation organization called the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, and so Jackson is my home base when I'm out there. So there are sources in Jackson that are about sometimes nothing bigger than Jackson Hole, which is a valley in which Jackson sits. And then there are larger, you know, sort of, there are folks writing about the larger region, and there are folks writing about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem sort of writ large, and then there are folks writing about the American West. And so I found all of these sources of information that I could follow, whether it's High Country News is an example of one, you know, that sort of like covers all sorts of Western issues, but which covers stuff that would be really relevant to the folks who I work with, even on the local level in Jackson. And keeping abreast of what these folks are writing and choosing to communicate about nature and culture and history helped me develop sense of place. So my response, Rachel, to you, and this is probably nothing new from me to you, you're probably doing this already, right? But that any of us, anywhere we live, should take the time to investigate those sources, helps us develop our sense of place and helps us sort of integrate our thinking as well as our practice into wherever we're living. And then what you find is that as you're sort of through osmosis and through concerted reading and everything else, gathering this information, it makes you a better communicator, right? Just because you have access to this information that's important for everybody. So that's the best I can do, not knowing New Mexico or Albuquerque well enough to sort of say, you know, something more specific, but that I feel like that approach benefits us all wherever we're living or working.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and again, I'm happy for Rachel, with you and for any of you to, if there are follow-up questions and you want to sort of dig deeper into something, I'm happy to do that offline or by email or on a separate call sometime.
Awesome. There looks like there's a question in the chat, Rich, from Anna. In recruiting from federal agencies to publish, are there specific kinds of papers you're looking for?
Yeah, it's a great question. Topically, so in my journal, we're very broad, and the title gives that away. Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. And the original description of the journal, again, I've only been sort of at the helm for a year, and the original description of the journal that I inherited was so all-encompassing that really anything could be included. We're somewhat narrower than that, right? We are at our heart an ecological journal, but much more broadly considered than that. And so we're not topically specific. And that's important. So like just looking back, so one of the things I was doing before we started here today was I was looking back over like the last several years worth of articles that my journal has published by National Park Service employee authors. And actually, because I had never done this search before, so thank you for inspiring me to get to know my own job better, something I should have done before. But I was looking at them topically, and they were really all over the place, right? There are National Park Service authors writing and submitting just to me, to say nothing of hundreds of journals to which National Park Service folks are submitting. So just to me on climate, obviously it's going to be sort of a top concern because there's a lot of climate related research going on in the national parks. Invasive species, interface with the public, new theories of management, you know, and sort of novel ecosystems given. So Yellowstone, you know, where I work is a prime example, right, of a place that's thought of, like the reputation of Yellowstone is this sort of frontier wilderness. And the thing about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that the sort of stereotype that folks who want to promote it in a really rosy way talk about it being like the Serengeti of North America, because you've got this full complement of ungulates and apex predators. And it is all of that, plus like 4 to 5 million visitors a year. And what people don't understand about Yellowstone Park itself is that it's just 60 miles to a side. So think about wherever you're sitting, think about the hour's drive that it would take you to go 60 miles. So Yellowstone's small. It feels big when you're there because it's got a huge sky and the mountains and all of that, but it's basically 60 miles to a side. So 5 million people a year, mostly between April and the end of September. So that just opens up an enormous diversity of concerns, ecological, climate, sort of interdisciplinary related to how you communicate science and conservation needs. So this is a long way around, Anna, your question, that we're looking for all of that stuff, right? And the way I tend to promote it with my friends and just folks from the agencies, from the Park Service and other agencies who contact me, is I answer the question with a question. What do you think it's important to get out into the community? You know, what information is important to get out into the community? And if you think about the type of work that's being done in the national parks, right, there's huge amounts of really wonderful basic research, but I'm not going to be publishing stuff on like the incubation periods of this species of bird versus that species of bird, or of, you know, the phenotypic and genotypic differences between two subspecies of plant. That's all really important information that we're gathering in national parks as well as lots of other places, but that's not what I'm interested in publishing in Frontiers. I need it to be stuff that's going to be broadly important to really, in terms of who my readership is, to the professional conservation community. That's how I tend to think of it. And then beyond that, any topic is welcome.
So like the impacts of his or her use because of COVID-19 on public lands would be an interesting publication for Frontiers, you think?
Yep, absolutely. And we've received lots of, I mean, especially now that people have had a little time to collect some data and write it up, we're receiving tons of manuscripts like that. Actually, the more than it, sorry, this is a tangent, but more than any other sort of subtopic of COVID-related research, the use of urban parks. Everybody, because it makes perfect sense, right? People are locked down and more people live in cities than elsewhere. And so there's been this huge boon for the urban parks researchers. So they're pumping out manuscripts. I'm seeing those all the time. But anyway, yes.
Cool.
Other questions?
Yeah, Anna, do you want anything? Do you want to add anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question to that. I guess what kind of like spurred my original question was because I noticed that a lot of the research that I see going on in national parks is like monitoring focused and looking at, you know, like just like more of the like simpler questions like where are things, you know, how can we know like where wildlife is and how does that affect how we can steward it, which isn't quite the like broad applications that you're talking about. So I was wondering if you know of any papers that are maybe more focused towards those kinds of questions, more like monitoring focused.
So you're asking about papers that I'm aware of that are about the monitoring as opposed to the more applied conservation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of like the other side of the research that goes on.
Yeah, so we would not probably publish as many of those. So let me, I should have said this earlier. So Frontiers, my journal is very small scale compared to most, and in part that's because we still have a print edition. I tend to wave it around when I get the opportunity. So here I'll wave it around. Look at our antiquated, archaic version of science publications. It's actually made out of paper from renewable trees, they say. So because we publish on paper and we publish 10 issues a year, we only publish 50 peer-reviewed articles a year. So that's nothing. And that's why I can say, you know, we're publishing like 2 to 3 National Park Service authors a year. It doesn't sound like much, but out of 50 articles a year, it's actually a pretty substantial proportion. Other Ecological Society journals and journals and other journals are publishing vastly larger numbers of articles, right? So I'll just speak sort of from what I know best, right? The Ecological Society journals have a number of different outlets for monitoring, for papers that are reporting on monitoring data. There'd be a place for that actually in almost all of the other Ecological Society journals. And it's not that it would never make it through review at Frontiers, right? But because we publish so few and we receive so many submissions, we're looking for sort of the greatest bang for the buck in terms of application. So the most conservation relevant manuscripts are the ones that I'm seeking to publish. But you know, ecosphere, ecology, ecological applications and ecological monographs are the other Ecological Society journals. And then of course there are hundreds of others, dozens of others probably, to be more accurate, that are very much like ours, and then hundreds of others that will publish work that we might publish as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I see another question, at least in the chat from Claire. who I also note, Claire, that you don't have access. I see that, and yes, I'm glad that you submitted your question. I was happy to talk about it. So the question is, how do you disseminate information to such a variety of readers, PhDs in a specific field, land managers, seasonal rangers, et cetera? Do publishing scientists have to simplify, condense the research to make it accessible to such a wide audience? Are your publications more often in-house field research or literature reviews? It's a great question. We have 4 principal manuscript types that we publish. One is sort of just a straightforward research paper, you know, introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion format, like so many other science journals. And then we have some sort of traditional review type paper, which is somebody has a question about a field, you know, that they're interested in exploring. And I hate to call it just a literature review, because it's more than that. It's actually trying to push forward thinking on a certain field by looking deeply at the work that's been done at it or done in it already. That's a review manuscript. Then we have something called Concepts and Questions, which is sort of based on the review model, but is more theoretical, but not theoretical in a sense of like esoteric, excuse me, theoretical in the sense that we have so many questions that we're asking about ecological change, about climate change, that we don't have the answers to. But we want desperately for folks to think about what we need to know in order to answer these questions, that you may not have empirical, you know, research or results on which to report, but you have a good sense of what the questions are. And so we have a paper type to suit those needs, to suit those interests as well. And then the last one is actually a short form, basically a sort of a research note. We call them letters, but they don't have to be literally letters in response to previous published articles. They're just very short things that that very briefly report on something of note in you know, in the applied environmental science or ecology field. And so because we have 4 very different types of papers that we publish, it opens the doors, because a lot of people have different interests. You know, there are the folks who are just simply interested in collecting their data that they think or they know is relevant to management or policy. And so we can allow them to report on their data. And then there are the folks who are thinking, like we had a good paper. I'm thinking about this because it was partially done by a team of folks in the Yellowstone ecosystem, including Park Service folks. I think lead authored by a guy at University of California, Berkeley. And it was about wildlife migrations, you know, and the question is, how do we do conservation of highly migratory species crossing multiple boundaries, right? Physical boundaries as well as political boundaries, like going between multiple states, going across all sorts of boundaries. How do we think about the ecological interactions that those species have with others, like where they sit in the food chain, and then taking that you know, those ideas, how do we think about national park management or protected area management or public lands management, given these species need to move over long distances and the huge barriers that there are to those movements? So that's a pretty applied, but also pretty conceptual set of questions that's incredibly relevant to Yellowstone, for example, as well as many, many other places all around the world. So that's a good example of sort of something that we love to publish, and that we did. In that case, it was a December 2019 paper. But the last part of the answer to this question really is that what we're looking for, given all these different types of orientations that people might have to what they want to write, we're really looking for folks who are interested in writing clearly for folks outside of their field. I've said that, and I'm sorry for being repetitive, but that's really important to us, right? That you're not writing just for folks who have the same background and understanding that you do, right? I want folks who are writing about climate to be understood by the folks who are writing about, you know, animal behavior, and I want the folks who are writing about, you know, atmospheric change to be understood by the folks who are studying soil science, and vice versa. So, other questions? There was one in the that was sent ahead of time. And the person who asked it isn't here, so I won't call them out by name, but the question was how best to prepare a manuscript to be submitted for review. And that's one that I get a lot, and it's one that I'd like to just talk about for a minute. And one of the things that all of us who are editors-in-chief of the journals at the Ecological Society believe is incredibly important to the process of communicating science is fostering community around that communication. So that sounds like a very big and vague idea. And what that means in practice is that we welcome anyone who's interested in publishing to contact us to talk about your interests in publishing before you jump through all the hoops necessary to meet all the stipulations of our author guidelines or any other, journals, and simply to have a conversation. And sometimes that translates into, just sort of quick advice, or, that, yeah, you're thinking along the right lines. And sometimes it translates into something sort of a more concerted mentoring effort. And that's great too. But all of that is about building the community, right, of folks who are interested in doing this applied work and having having a voice, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what we're interested at the Ecological Society. That's what we're interested in doing, is giving those of you who want to publish your work a voice. So when people ask, when people ask me sort of how do I get started, right? I haven't, particularly somebody say starting a doctoral program, who hasn't published yet, or in a master's program and just thinking about publishing, or an undergrad who's looking at that down the road and saying, how do I even start to think about publishing? And the first step is to, find somebody who's willing to talk to you about it. And so here I'm one. All of the editors-in-chief of the Ecological Society journals feel the same way that I do, and are also willing to respond to emails. If you go onto a journals, there are some pretty prominent journals in our field, which unfortunately sort of don't feel the same way. And for them, I guess it's a workload management issue. But there are some really prominent journals in our field where if you go to their websites, at the very top of the website, before you can even find where to click on the author guidelines, it says, we do not accept or respond to pre-submission inquiries. And I just think that's terrible, because it's basically telling you, sorry, what we do and what you need to do is part of a hoop that we're going to make you jump through. And if you miss the hoop, you're shit out of luck, because we're not going to help you prepare for that jump beforehand. So enough about the negative. At the Ecological Society, what we're trying to do is to dispense with that approach entirely and build a community of folks who want to have a voice. So it's really important to us. Other questions?
I'm kind of curious, Miles or Aaron, Victoria, and Guadalupe, I don't know what brought you all here today, but if there's something about this description that drew you in, so maybe kind of talking about kind of where you are envisioning yourself in terms of publication, and maybe any obstacles that you've seen coming through this process. It's not necessarily just bring your questions to Rich, as so much as it is also an opportunity for Rich to learn about barriers for others as well. So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of reposition the thought here and let you know that you can also just bring comments to the table if you want.
Yeah, I think I might take you up on that, because Rich, really appreciated the note about like the different kinds of like papers and the different like types of things. I am like really brand new to this. My background was mostly like math and statistics from Penn State, like undergrad. And then this is like my first like internship and first foray into really any sort of like researchy kind of stuff. So a question that I had was, I was working with my supervisor on starting to think about like, how am I going to share the work that I'm doing? Specifically, like I've generated a new data set of frog calls with like annotations around individual types of frogs, and some code to build machine learning models for frog identification. And like, I really enjoy it. And I'm starting to realize like nothing that I'm doing is really like novel or new. I'm taking and synthesizing a lot of like different things that have been out there, but I'm going to have like a full data set. I'm going to have some code. And ultimately, my supervisor wants to work with me to like get like a technical report on the like national park side. I guess I don't really like, is there an outlet for that kind of stuff where it's really more like data code, and like a little bit of analysis, even if it's not groundbreaking stuff? Like, I guess, where would you point somebody like me to go looking into the future?
We have a journal for that. I mean, more or less. So the way that you described it actually was really helpful. The idea of novelty is more important to some journals than others, right? And so at Frontiers and at our journal, the journal is simply called Ecology. Novelty is important. It's an important criteria when we're looking at what to publish. And by novelty, I really mean like, you know, or is the paper that we're looking at offering something to the field that is a different perspective or new data that opens up a new research channel, or, you know, that sort of novelty. But our journal, Ecosphere, has no novelty criteria. They are just looking for new and interesting science. And I'm not expert enough in Ecosphere's particular inner workings to be able to guide you specifically, but if you go to their website, you'll see how it's structured very differently from the other journals. It's got a lot of sort of subsets. It's really more like 20 journals in one. And so you go to the Ecosphere website, and then there are a whole bunch of different types of manuscripts, and some are topical, but some are more sort of like areas of consideration as opposed to topics. And I'm guessing that you're going to find probably more than one of them that fits what you're doing. And then you would be able to look there. And that, let me just sort of say generally, that's a really important innovation in publishing, right? That's something that the Ecological Society has done pretty well. We've got really traditional journals in ecology and ecological monographs, which are really by and for ecologists. We've got Frontiers, which is sort of the broad, sort of facing the larger applied professional community. And we've got Ecosphere, which is really this great melting pot of a lot of different basic research, basic and applied research.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thanks. That's, and everything else is, I'm just like an information sponge at this point. So that is ultimately what drew me to this webinar as well.
Excellent. But I'm interested to get back to Jessica's questions, particularly if any of you have had, you know, particular concerns or actual impediments, you know, to your desires or intent or attempts to publish. You know, I mean, I had the first lead authored manuscript I ever sent to a journal. I got a letter back from the editor-in-chief that was basically angry at me for wasting his time. And I was a graduate student. I was an early graduate student at the time, right? So you just have to figure out how not to let that be crushing, right? When you're hearing from somebody who actually had written a textbook that I had used in grad school and who I, you know, had certain very big thoughts about. And then my one personal interaction with them was just awful. Here's an irony. Sorry, I'm being cagey on purpose because I don't want to speak ill of people. But that journal is the same one that now, 30 something years later, has the "do not contact us before you submit" notice on the top of their homepage. No, I guess no coincidence. They haven't evolved all that much since then. It's funny, that just occurred to me. Anyway, so back to Jessica's question, you know, concerns, impediments, worries. Because it does help us, like Jessica said, to learn about that. That's how we adapt and evolve.
Well, it looks like Victoria and I have had a little back and forth in terms of, you know, she's geology focused. So kind of seeing if there's any significant differences in terms of, you know, the responses that you're saying about ESA's journals. Victoria, speak for yourself if you can.
Yeah, so I didn't really have anything in particular kind of to chime in on or questions or anything. I've just been listening in. So I've published before in geology journals, and you know, saw this webinar pop up in my email and kind of just wanted to listen in and see how ESA does things different than my experience with previous geology journals. So nothing, you know, really big, no big differences really stand out, but I'm just really liking what you're saying about encouraging authors pre-submission to get in touch. That was not my experience when I published in kind of a big geology journal that, you know, for whatever reason just was, you know, focused on submissions and you know, getting things through once they'd been submitted. But then yeah, didn't have much pre-submission help available. So just hearing you say that is really interesting and really wonderful. And yeah, I've just enjoyed listening in on the conversation. So thank you.
My pleasure. You did get, despite the lack of sort of the smooth entry into the process, you did get published in the Geology Journal, and it had a happy ending.
I did, yes.
Good, excellent. It's you know, it's I mean, I'm sorry I'm being redundant now, but it's the Ecological Society sort of, it's not limited to the Ecological Society, this desire to build community through the work that we're doing, right? I mean, obviously what Jessica and Jessie are doing is very explicitly building community, but academic publishing is not traditionally about that, right? So, but it should be, it could be, if you think about what the peer review process is, right? You know, there's the light and truth side, right? Not to be silly about it, right? And then there's the dark side, right? And the dark side is that it's all, you know, like a trial by fire, and the peer review process is meant to be harsh, and we say, hell with that. That's wrong, right? That doesn't encourage anybody to do what we think that that needs to be done. So what I'm telling you, sort of, I've repeatedly said that the other editors-in-chief and I have this particular approach, but so do our editorial board members, and so do our reviewers. And it only takes, like for my editorial board, there's a one strike and you're out. Not for my editorial board, sorry, for my reviewers. Like we have a, you know, huge amount of, as you might imagine, there are just lots of people who we call upon to do reviews. But we have a one strike and you're out policy. So if we get a review back that is disrespectful, that person will never get asked again, because there's no space in which a disrespectful review is allowable. And in fact, I won't share it. And even if it means I have to go to get another reviewer, even if that means a delay in the manuscript, and now we're getting into the weeds, and we don't need to talk about the sort of logistics of it unless you want to, or I'll take liberties and only communicate part of the review and just cut the bad stuff out, which is the prerogative of the editor-in-chief.
That's really wonderful to hear. That's, yeah. Having been on, you know, the receiving end of some, you know, not great comments. It's really wonderful to hear that.
I'm glad, and we feel really strongly about it. We talk about it all the time, actually.
So it's funny because I was thinking in my mind, how many people that are SIP interns are currently even thinking about trying to pursue publication about their experience or internship experience. And then I saw Claire's comment here in the chat about, you know, that you have a genuine interest, but you're feeling as though the people you may be directly collaborating with in your internship don't have the same drive for the publication. And whether or not, Rich, you've seen that the publications that are coming from MPS are predominantly from PhD holding employees. Yeah. You know, and I would probably take a safe bet and say, yeah, on that one, you know, a big, but not necessarily, you know, I mean, like I worked for a guy in a state, herpetologist in Virginia, who did not hold a PhD, but was very motivated to publish a lot of his findings because he was working with rare and threatened endangered species, and it was important, valued work that needed to be relayed to the public. But also because he had a lot of collaborative work with the surrounding universities. And so having that tie to academia kind of also, I think, drove the need for publishing, because a lot of people in academia are evaluated on their number of publications, right? So
Yeah.
they were driving that need for publication, and then through that, so it was like the state or the federal people had the funds to employ the interns, and then the partnership with the university PIs had the drive for the publications. So I don't know, Claire, if that's even an option, and I'm kind of, Rich, you feel free to chime in here, but like, that's something from my personal experience. I noticed that it was more likely if you were working with just a land manager, you would probably have to carry the brunt of the work if you genuinely wanted to publish. But if that land manager had partners in that partnership directly related to some of the research that was happening in their lab, then now you have another person that can kind of help you mold your paper.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And you know, the challenge is to find yourself, you know, depending on what professional path you choose, you know, whether grad school is not whether the sort of multiple stages of grad school is not in the immediate plan, you can still find folks who are interested in communicating what it is, you know, the research that is that they're doing. And I mean, I'll use as an example, like I have a friend in one of the national parks who doesn't have a PhD, and who at this point now is you know, still relatively young, but getting on towards being consistently employed by the National Park Service for long enough to be to be considered an old hand. And I recruited a manuscript from her because she's doing work that, frankly, very few other people are doing. But her boss is a PhD holder, and for all I know, I haven't seen this particular manuscript yet. For all I know, he'll end up being I don't know how the power dynamics in their particular program work. She's the one I'm working with, and she's the one who's clearly leading the charge on this paper. Whether her boss with the PhD will end up being the lead author, I can't answer that. But the challenge for folks who are sort of, this was the same for me when I was in my early 20s and sort of thinking about how I wanted to do this in my career, was to find somebody who was willing to be, you know, a mentor, and that's harder than it sounds, I know, you know, but I ended up going through those multiple steps of grad school in order to get there, right? And I had a couple of, this is, sorry to sort of belabor this, I had sort of two main advisors once I got to my doctoral work. I did my master's and my doctoral work at the same place. So these were both folks that I had started working with as a master's student. And one of them saw as their role sort of pushing me through the hoops and seeing how I would do, and was happy to do research together in which I would be the research assistant, but not be the co-author. And you know, and this person, this advisor's idea of reward structure was to thank all of his students in the acknowledgement section of the papers that he wrote. And the other advisor that I had actually was responsible for my first paper. And she took a whole class and she said, let's write this up and submit it somewhere. And it ended up getting published. And to make a really long story short, I was like, okay, this is the person I want to be my mentor. And to fast forward, that was more than 30 years ago, and we have published about 25 papers together since, and she became my principal research partner through my career. And that was sort of luck and privilege of place that I happen to be and who I was working with. But if you can work it so that you find people who are willing to work with you, and then support your goals, as opposed to use your time to support their goals, that's the key. To get to a technical question, which is embedded in Claire's question in the chat, and which Jessica spoke to a little bit as well. And Jessica, you are right. Most of the papers that we receive are written by folks with PhDs, but that's not a prerequisite. I don't check people's degrees, like when I'm reviewing manuscripts. And so that, that doesn't matter. Like I said, I recruited this paper from this friend of mine who works for the Park Service. She doesn't have a PhD, but that's, I think, partially because, and this is not just true of Frontiers, but for all so-called academic journals, right? The vast majority of our readership is PhD holding folks. And we aspire at my journal, Frontiers, to be read more broadly than that by folks in government, by folks in the NGOs who are responsible for applied conservation programs that we're publishing about. And we do publish work by them, but our journal's behind a paywall that's controlled by a big multinational publisher, right? And if you're not at an academic institution that has a library that has journal access privileges, then you may not have access. So, and that's a whole separate discussion about open access, and we don't have time to talk about that today. But that's one of the impediments, right, to sort of broadening our scope to folks who are not PhD holders, but who are in non-academic careers. But we're working on that too. Yes, and Claire, to your follow-up comment there, thank you. It was a long time ago and it's fine, but the looking for employers who are willing to support your goals, particularly, I think at an early stage of the game is really essential.
Yeah, I would have that discussion. I'm hearing an echo. I don't know why. But I would have the discussion with your coworkers or land managers that if they have partners that they think are gonna, I don't know why I'm echoing so bad, but
I don't hear it.
Okay, I hear it, but maybe it's just my headphones reverberating. I don't know. If they intend to publish the work, who their partners may be, and if you can kind of find authorship through collaboration, because authorship can be a contentious topic that you should probably address early on in any stage of doing research projects, if you think that there's going to be a publication that comes out of it, so that you are aware of whether or not you are going to be put in that acknowledgement section, or you get to be slapped in the middle of the pile of our authors, or you even get first authorship if you're lucky. So yeah, and that's something that goes on a lot in grad school too, more so than I am aware of with the internships process, but you never know. But that's it. We're at an hour. Does anybody have any lasting questions they're like burning to ask Rich before we head off? Okay, I guess not. So
all right, that's my email. So that's what I would close with, is if you have any questions that you think of later, you want to be in touch, you want to ask anything that you didn't want to ask publicly, be in touch. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Or as you progress through your process,
That too.
and you're getting a little bit closer to a stage where you think you have a manuscript prepared, good to know you have an editor you now know a face and email,
Yes.
and he's a real person, not a robot who's just going to give you desk rejection.
That's right.
So thank you, Rich, for your time. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for asking me, and thank all of you for coming and spending the hour with us. This has been great.
And if you're interested to know more about why science communication is important, that's our next webinar. Right. The registration link was in the chat, but we're going to keep doing these each month, depending on how long your internship is. I mean, if you want to sign up for them, like just email sipfellows@esa.org, and we'll send you a link, even if you're done with your internship. It's okay. I'm all about students having access to anything that makes them stronger and more competitive as they enter their careers. So, not students too, because I know that SIP interns don't necessarily have to be students. So early career scientists, whatever you call yourselves. A smart, aspiring future.
Right.
Jessie, thanks. Okay, I think I'm just rambling. So, Rich, you want to hang out back for just 1 minute, and then thank you all to those who came. Email Rich if you have questions.
Yep, please. Great meeting you all.